So let's start this watching brief with a series of updates, I suppose. So starting with the Bovis Homes situation that we highlighted last month, that was literally breaking that morning. In fact, I seem to recall.
It was
Uh,
indeed, yeah.
how has that proceeded in the past 30 days or so?
Well, it proceeded very quickly. In fact, just to remind people what had happened, there was a development site in Dursley in Gloucestershire where a small Roman villa had turned up, which hadn't been dug before the development actually started, because the local authority only imposed a watching brief, not a full pre-excavation,
Hmm.
and the local people were very upset at the idea that this particular building, which they saw as their villa, might be destroyed by the new housing development of several
Hmm.
hundred new houses built by Bovis. Um, Cut to the chase, after a very successful petition that was started by local people, over 5,500 signatures in in just a few days.
Hmm.
The local authority, Bovis, and other interested parties got together and have basically undertaken to revise the plans to make sure that the building is actually preserved.
Hmm.
Interestingly, what appears to have happened is that the county archaeologist for Gloucestershire recommended a more full um, pre-construction archaeological survey,
Hmm.
but that was overridden by the local planning authority, the local district council, who were actually responsible for the development. So um, there's a the faint smell of a cock up
Yeah,
in
yeah,
this.
and that was probably the best case scenario that we were hinting at last month when we saw
Yes,
this. And it was also interesting that they're going to go ahead with some element of preservation in situ by the sound of it.
that's right.
Um, this is actually very similar to the bathhouse in Prestatyn. My
Oh, right.
closest Roman thing, just across
Yeah.
a rugby pitch between my house uh, and the bathhouse is the rugby pitch. But the thing is, this bathhouse was preserved in a 1980s, I think, build of a bungalow estate, and it was called Caldarium Estate. So presumably they're going to name it something similar in this instance. But that's good, good. In so much as it doesn't always have to be nefarious, does it? When we find something interesting in the news,
Ab-
yeah,
Absolutely not. And I think actually one very quick point on that. I think it shows the importance really that developers and local authorities really take cognizance of what local communities think of their heritage. Their heritage. We talk a lot about sense of place,
hmm,
and this was and heritage giving a sense of place.
mm,
And we've got an example here of local people effectively overriding
hmm,
what their own elected local authority wanted to do, and basically saying this is our place and we want to keep our piece of heritage.
yeah, a bit of history for them literally to dive into. Well, in the spirit of updates, let's move on to very briefly. We have news that Italian museums, quote, the headline says here, are shuttering due to coronavirus concerns. And this has also been followed up, I think, yesterday with the news that universities and schools are closing for 10 days in parts of Italy as well. This is inevitably having an impact on the sector there in terms of the heritage sector. Obviously, again, that's the main concern of the watching brief. But also, I guess the reason why we're mentioning it as well is it's almost inevitably going to happen here as well at some point.
Certainly, all the mood music coming out of the
Mm,
government and Whitehall and medical experts who were interviewed on the media and so on. Yes, this is going to the disruption caused by coronavirus, COVID-19, is going to get worse before it gets better. And obviously, the most important thing is the personal impact it's going to have on people, and not
mm,
least people who, obviously, in the thankfully it seems relatively rare cases that people actually are killed by
mm,
this new virus, but also people having to take time off work. This new phrase we're dealing with now, self isolation,
mm,
where we or voluntary isolation, where we don't go into work if we fear we might be coming down with this thing.
mm,
Um, it's it, it really is an unknown quantity at the moment, and the impact it will have. I was in central London yesterday, and it actually felt very normal.
mm-hmm,
The numbers around felt very normal. Very in fact, I could count on the fingers of one hand the number of people I saw wearing a face mask, which has become a current
Hmm.
object of conversation.
Hmm.
Um, but uh, there, you hear anecdotal reports of, for example, tour firms with their bookings being cancelled
Yeah, yeah.
and so on.
Well,
So
and this morning.
it's clearly going to have a. Sorry,
So,
go on.
well, I was going to say, and on that note, this morning, an airline is partially blaming coronavirus for its collapse. Presumably, it must have been flying, no pun intended, flying close to the wind already economically, but
It's
a drop in
we're talking about
bookings had a big effect. Flybe, I
we're
think it's
talking
called.
we're talking
Yeah,
about Flybe,
yeah.
indeed. Yeah, that collapsed this morning, the loss of several thousand jobs,
Mm,
and damage to the connectivity of the UK. Basically, it was an internal airline,
yeah,
and particularly places like Northern Ireland are going to be quite badly hit by it because a large number of the flights to and from the north of Ireland are by Flybe.
yeah, yeah.
Same applies for Cornwall.
Mm,
The So yeah, it's going to be extremely disruptive,
mm.
and the heritage sector is going to suffer along with everybody else.
Yeah,
We're
well,
all part of the same.
and undoubtedly we'll be returning to this in coming months, I suppose. It's definitely going
Sadly,
to
I'm
happen.
sure we will. Yeah.
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 Next, we have in our updates the CBA, Council for British Archaeology, has announced its new executive director, replacing Mike Hayworth,
Yep. We're
as
standing down after 10 years.
yeah, exactly 10 years, blimey, as Neil Redfern, who, much to my shame, I had not heard of until just now, or indeed just the other day when he was appointed. You described him as a safe appointee. How do you mean? What do you mean by that?
I mean that if you look at his CV, he's a long-standing. He was with an earlier incarnation of the CBA. He was a project officer on the Defence of Britain project,
Okay.
but most of his recent career has actually been with Historic England and developing protection plans in Yorkshire, and then
Hmm.
later nationally as a chief inspector of ancient monuments and a field monuments warden. Um, so he's very much an insider in terms of planning archaeology and the archaeological establishment, for want of a better word.
Mm. Well, and
Um,
but also as well that sounds like not only as it were safe in terms of pre-existing relationships and connections, but also an indication of a direction in so much as it indicates what possibly the CBA thinks is going to be required in the near future, i.e., someone who is an advocate of planning, policy, etc., and protection.
very much so,
Hmm.
very much so. And remember again, hate to use the B word this early in this month's watching brief, but obviously
Breakfast.
Brexit is
Oh, Brexit.
yes, Brexit means breakfast. Yeah, I have muesli this morning.
But have you
The,
had a patriotic breakfast?
it's too early to be doing Muppet of the Month. Just Google patriotic breakfast and look on Twitter. Um, but no, the, it, it's become clear in the last few weeks that the Johnson government is planning to clear the decks, basically to deregulate from the European Union rules,
Mm,
and that could have a considerable impact on planning and the environment. And
mm,
so, having somebody who's on the inside track of the organisations that are going to be directly affected by this is probably a justification for this kind of appointment.
yeah, yeah, and so in the past I've interviewed Mike twice, I think, for RKC, and I think I may well reach out to Neil as soon as possible. Obviously, yeah, give him time to bed in, though. Like a rose bush or something. You need some time to settle. Uh, and our final update for this section is the successful legal challenge of the third runway at Heathrow, and how that also connects possibly to other elements of British life. It's an interesting one
Absolutely.
in so much as this has been defeated on seemingly grounds that the government didn't do its due diligence in terms of planning.
But not the government didn't do its due
No,
diligence. It was a decision that was made under Chris Grayling, who's probably the most incompetent government minister in living memory, against some competition.
Is this the guy who hired a ferry company that didn't have any ferries?
This is the same man. Uh, the, uh, some of the newspapers have done the sums, and the aggregate cost of his various decisions um, certainly runs into tens of millions of pounds to the Exchequer, if not more.
Wow.
And some people argue, actually more seriously, that a botched reorganisation of the probation service, privatising part of it, has actually cost some people their lives in
Right.
terms of
Right.
So Mr. Grayling has had a very patchy record, being kind, running up into this. What happened was a legal challenge was made to British Airports who wanted to build a third runway at London Heathrow to expand the airport. The idea was that it would be completed by 2030,
Hmm.
and increase the capacity of London Heathrow. And the problem was that when the government gave this the green light, Grayling appears to have taken the view that it wasn't necessary to take into account the Paris Climate Accords.
Hmm. Hmm.
Unfortunately, the court decided otherwise. And basically, this has knocked the entire project on the head. British airports are going to appeal. The owners of Heathrow are going to appeal, but the government has said it's not going to appeal, which suggests that the government is backing away from this at a rate of knots. It's not unconnected with the fact that one of the local MP whose constituency is directly affected by this, and who once claimed that he would lie in front of a bulldozer to prevent the third runway at Heathrow, is one Boris Johnson,
Right.
who some people might remember is the part-time Prime Minister of the country.
Google that as well, I suppose, if you want to. Yes, absolutely. But also,
Discuss, yeah.
it discuss. But interestingly, this also has knock-on effects for, well, as you say, for things like, for example, HS2 and also Stonehenge. But also, crucially, it's actually also the thin end of the wedge for people like, for example, Chris Packham, a notable nature television presenter. Um,
Yeah.
so, I mean,
And environmentalist,
well,
very
yeah,
active environmentalist.
yeah, um, to openly challenge HS2 in a very publicly what's the word, accessible way. This is it's a big sort of lightning rod now to challenge these sort of these public civil engineering systems.
Absolutely right. I mean, yeah, exactly. The importance of this. And I was being a bit flippant earlier and a bit tongue in cheek, but the real importance of this is that it has established that, in legal terms, the government's undertakings under the Paris Climate Accords
Hmm.
are enforceable,
Hmm.
and that if a project can be shown not to have done proper due diligence with regard to the Paris Accords and environmental legislation, the details of environmental legislation, then projects can be stopped dead in their tracks,
Hmm.
even if they are, flagship infrastructure projects like the Heathrow third runway.
Hmm.
So and in terms of the heritage sector, it does two things. One, obviously, it gives another potential stick for campaigners who are against some of these projects, like HS2,
Hmm.
like possibly the A303 tunnel at Stonehenge, to go back to the courts and say, is this project in accordance with climate change undertakings?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which means possibly more delays and more expense, even if the court ultimately decides the project is okay. London Heathrow third runway, of course, would have been a major project for UK archaeology,
Hmm.
and so if, as seems likely, it's going to be at best, for the airports, from the airport's point of view, delayed yet again, at worst completely cancelled, then those are archaeological jobs that aren't going to be there for the next few years.
No, exactly. Yeah. Well, and on that note, I suppose things like, for example, HS2, the last thing they need is extra cost. At the moment they're
Yes.
kind of just about making it through in terms of cost viability and what's
Yeah.
the word, value for money. So yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's our updates. I guess things to keep an eye on, breaking news, etc. And also congratulations to Neil on his appointment. I suppose
Absolutely.
we look forward to
Watch this
seeing
space.
what happens next.